Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Whatever you've got going on tomorrow, it can wait until morning. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and strange, somewhere tucked back in the edges of television history, a place where construction paper kids once said something so loud that the actual, physical, real world had to respond to it. We're talking about the banned episodes of South Park. Not the ones that got a stern letter from a parent council in 1999. Not the ones that made someone's mom call the network. Not the ones that generated 5,000 angry emails and then quietly aired again the following week as if nothing happened. The real ones. The 5 episodes that are still, right now, at this exact moment, as you listen to this, impossible to stream legally on any platform in the world. The episodes that don't exist on Paramount+. The episodes that were quietly removed from HBO Max and never came back. The ones that even the official South Park website won't host, where a placeholder message still appears in some regions reading simply, flatly, "We apologize that South Park Studios cannot stream this episode." 5 episodes, out of more than 330 that have aired across almost 3 decades of television. 5. And the reason they're gone isn't what you might think when you first hear it. It's not because they were too crude or too offensive in the way that South Park is normally offensive. It's not because someone said a word too many times. It's not because an episode went after a celebrity who had particularly good lawyers, or because a joke about a religion landed so badly that a network felt it had to apologize. The reason these 5 specific episodes vanished from every legal platform in the world is something more complicated, more layered, and genuinely more sobering than any of that. It starts with a cartoon that aired on July 4th, 2001. An episode that aired to almost zero controversy. An episode that millions of people watched and then moved on from, because it was just another night in the mountain town of South Park, Colorado, and there were a lot of those nights. An episode that sat in rotation for years, quietly, harmlessly, replaying whenever the network needed to fill a slot, until the world shifted underneath it, and suddenly an old cartoon about a street magician and a team of religious superheroes became the center of something much larger and much more dangerous than anyone who made it had intended. And it ends with death threats, with actual police officers standing outside actual office buildings in Manhattan, with a man being sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with a speech about the power of violence and intimidation being officially, formally censored by a television network that was afraid of violence and intimidation. With a creator so furious that he bought a one-way plane ticket and showed it to an executive as a statement. So let's go through all of it tonight, slowly, the way you do late at night, when the world is still and there's nowhere else to be. Because this is one of those stories where the details matter as much as the headline, and the details are extraordinary. Let yourself settle in. There's no rush. Part 1. The construction paper world. Understanding what South Park actually was. Before we get into the specific episodes, before any of the controversy makes sense, it helps to understand what kind of show South Park actually was when it first arrived. Because in 1997, there was nothing like it on American television. Nothing that looked like it. Nothing that sounded like it. And nothing that had been born the way it had been born. Trey Parker and Matt Stone were film students at the University of Colorado in Boulder who had met in class, immediately recognized each other as people who found the same strange, transgressive things funny, and spent most of their time doing voices and making each other laugh instead of completing their coursework. Parker had already won a Student Academy Award for an animated short that used cutout paper figures. He knew the style, he knew what it could do. In December 1992, they made a short animated film using actual construction paper, actual glue, and an old 8mm film camera. They called it The Spirit of Christmas. It featured 4 paper children, rough prototypes of what would become Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, accidentally bringing a snowman to life and then watching as a rather irritated Jesus Christ arrived to fight it. The short played at a student film screening, got some laughs from people who appreciated its absolute refusal to be respectable, and then essentially disappeared. That wasn't the version that mattered. 3 years later, in 1995, a Fox broadcasting executive named Brian Graydon paid Parker and Stone $2,000 to make a new version of that short as a video Christmas card he could send to friends. The budget for actual production was reportedly around $750, with Parker and Stone keeping the rest of the commission as their fee. This time, instead of Jesus fighting a snowman in the Colorado mountains, it was Jesus versus Santa Claus, locked in a heated argument over the true meaning of Christmas that devolved into the two of them absolutely wrecking each other, while four paper children stood at a safe distance and deployed profanity with the matter-of-fact fluency of people who had been doing it for years. Kenny gets killed. Kyle is established as Jewish. The foundation of the entire show is right there in 5 minutes of construction paper. Graydon sent the short to approximately 80 friends in December 1995. One of those friends was, according to persistent rumor, George Clooney. The tape got copied. Then it got copied again. Someone digitized it and put it online in a period when most people didn't yet have internet connections that could download video in any reasonable amount of time. Copies were shared on floppy disks. Physical VHS tapes were duplicated by hand and passed around Hollywood. And within months, this crude little construction paper Christmas card had become one of the very first viral videos in internet history, shared through connections and systems that barely existed, spreading without any authorization or marketing, because people couldn't stop showing it to each other. It was one of the earliest demonstrations of what the internet could do to content that resonated. Not the professionally distributed content. Not the content with a marketing budget and a network behind it. The handmade thing. The thing that existed specifically because two college students found it funny and someone else found it funny enough to share. The mechanism of that spread was itself a kind of small cultural disruption. When Comedy Central commissioned the show from what they'd seen and heard, they were already getting an institution that had been born outside of institutional channels, an entity that had spread without permission, a show that had never asked anyone's approval before it started talking to people. The pilot episode, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe, aired on August 13, 1997 at 10 in the evening, and pulled a Nielsen rating of 1.3, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For cable television in 1997, that was enormous. Comedy Central was still a relatively minor network. This one show was already pushing it towards something else. The complaints began immediately. The Parents Television Council, an organization that would become one of South Park's most persistent critics over the following 2 decades, called the show so offensive it shouldn't have been made. Schools started banning South Park t-shirts. A group of school principals in New Jersey launched campaigns specifically to warn parents about the show's content. Hickory Flat Elementary in Georgia issued an outright ban on any South Park clothing, not just the shirts, all clothing featuring any South Park imagery. The show was moved to midnight after complaints about the 10 o'clock time slot, and the audience kept growing. By the time the Season 1 episode Damien aired, ratings had climbed to a 6.4. In the spring of 1998, 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on basic cable were South Park episodes. The show wasn't just popular, it was a phenomenon. And it was a phenomenon that was somehow simultaneously too offensive for polite society and one of the most watched things on television. In a 1999 poll conducted by a bank in the United Kingdom, 8- and 9-year-old children voted Eric Cartman as their favorite personality. Not their favorite cartoon character, their favorite personality, above real human beings. The headmaster of a school in Cambridge publicly urged parents to stop letting their children watch. Parent councils were genuinely disturbed that the character children had selected as their personal role model was, by any analysis, an anti-Semitic, racist, manipulative sociopath. But that same first season also contained Episode 3, Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, which aired on September 3, 1997, and was one of the most sympathetic portrayals of a gay character on American television at the time. It was nominated for a GLAAD award for Outstanding Individual Episode. The show that was supposedly corrupting children was simultaneously producing some of the most genuinely empathetic content about marginalized communities that basic cable had ever aired. That tension between the shock and the heart, between what the show appeared to be on the surface and what it was actually doing underneath, is the essential quality that makes South Park's controversy history so endlessly interesting to sit with. It is not a simple thing. It has never been a simple thing. And the story of its 5 band episodes is the clearest demonstration of how unsimple it can get. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. It genuinely means something to me to picture the geography of where this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, going ahead and doing that genuinely helps this kind of content keep going. Now, let's begin properly. Part 2. Super Best Friends, the episode that got banned 9 years after it aired. It is July 4th, 2001, Independence Day in the United States. The kind of warm midsummer night when the air still carries the trace of fireworks, when people are on porches and in front of televisions and living their ordinary lives in the ordinary way, not thinking about how anything might change. It's a holiday. It's summer. The world is the shape it is. On Comedy Central, Season 5, Episode 3 of South Park aired. It was called Super Best Friends, and the promotional materials described it as being about a magician. David Blaine, the real-life street illusionist who had become genuinely famous in the late 1990s, through a series of television specials showing him performing endurance feats like standing on a pillar for hours or being submerged in water, comes to the fictional mountain town of South Park. He performs in the street, he dazzles the locals, he levitates. He does things that seem impossible. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, along with most of the rest of the town, are immediately captivated, and before long they've joined his group, which the show calls the Blaintologists. In the DVD commentary for the episode, Trey Parker stated plainly that the Blaintology cult was intended as a direct reference to Scientology. The same basic structure: a charismatic leader, followers who are made to feel special for having been chosen, secret knowledge that costs money to access, methods that discourage doubt and reward surrender. Blaine was the stand-in because the time wasn't right to go directly at Scientology yet. Isaac Hayes was still voicing Chef, and he was a Scientologist, and Parker and Stone weren't willing to create that conflict yet. So the shape of the satire used a different name. Stan, who functions in South Park as the show's frequently baffled voice of reason, quickly becomes uncomfortable with how the Blaintologists operate. He sees the manipulation underneath the performance. He tries to warn Kyle. Kyle refuses to listen. Kyle is in deep. Stan tries to leave the cult and finds himself essentially shunned by his oldest friend, which is a genuinely well-observed detail about how these kinds of groups work. They don't just recruit, they isolate. So Stan goes to the one person he can think of who might have the actual power needed to counteract a megalomaniacal cult leader with real followers and real momentum. He goes to Jesus. Jesus in South Park's universe is a recurring presence. He exists in the show's world as something like a local celebrity, a known entity who can be found in Colorado, who hosts a public access television program where he takes questions from callers, who is generally pleasant and well-meaning, if slightly out of his depth, when it comes to modern social dynamics. He performs miracles, but quietly, in ways that don't attract too much attention. When Jesus shows up to David Blaine's massive stage show in Denver to challenge him, there's an immediate practical problem. Jesus tries to perform his miracle of the loaves and the fish. He asks everyone in the audience to turn around so they don't see how he does it. By the time they turn back, the trick is done, but nobody's impressed. Blaine, meanwhile, is doing things like freezing himself in a block of ice and hovering 10 feet above the stage, and he's doing them in full view of everyone, and the audience is absolutely losing their minds. Jesus gets outclassed completely. He needs help. Jesus calls upon the Super Best Friends. The Super Best Friends are a team of the most significant religious figures in human history, assembled in the format of a superhero team. A direct parody of the 1970s Hanna-Barbera animated series Super Friends, which itself was a version of DC Comics' Justice League presented for Saturday morning television in the era when superhero cartoons were ubiquitous. They operate out of a Hall of Super Best Friends that is architecturally nearly identical to the Hall of Justice from the original cartoon. They have a receptionist. They have a briefing room. They take the world seriously. The team consists of Jesus, who can walk on water and turn water into wine and perform miracles of various descriptions. Buddha, who gets a note that he doesn't really believe in evil, which creates some operational challenges for a superhero team. Moses, who appears not as a recognizable human figure but as a large geometric shape that radiates light and speaks in a powerful synthesized voice, which is either a theological statement about the nature of the divine or a production budget decision, or possibly both. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, who has ice powers that he deploys with genuine enthusiasm. Krishna, the Hindu deity, who can shapeshift into any form, which turns out to be extremely useful. Lao Tse, the ancient Chinese philosopher, credited with founding Taoism. Seaman, who is a direct parody of Aquaman, complete with the ability to communicate with sea creatures and whose name the other team members cannot get through without lapsing into barely suppressed amusement because it sounds like something else entirely. And Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, who has the power of fire. He can fly, he deploys pyrokinesis, he's fully present in the episode. Muhammad is drawn, he has a face, he has a costume. He appears in numerous scenes. He uses his abilities to help the team in their confrontations with Blaine's forces. He is portrayed in an entirely heroic, positive, warm-hearted light. He stands alongside Jesus and Buddha and Moses as a peer and an equal. The show treats him with exactly the same combination of absurdist affection and gentle irreverence that it applies to every other member of the team. There is nothing hostile in the depiction. There is nothing mocking in the specific, targeted way that some South Park episodes can mock. He's just one of the heroes. The episode's climax involves an extraordinary sequence in which David Blaine, cornered at the reflecting pool in Washington, animates the giant stone statue of Abraham Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial and sends it to destroy the Super Best Friends. The Super Best Friends respond, after a brief strategic conference, by animating a giant stone statue of John Wilkes Booth, which shoots the Lincoln statue in the back of the head. The Lincoln statue falls and shatters, freeing Kyle from the glass bubble he'd been imprisoned in. Blaine escapes in a rocket ship, vowing some vague future revenge that never materializes. The day is saved. Stan addresses the crowd of surviving Blantologists and tells them that any religion that makes you give up your money and your autonomy isn't a religion. It's a cult. Sahil and Stan reconcile in a genuinely sweet moment, and then they take turns kicking Cartman in the crotch because he'd been insufferable throughout and deserves it. When the episode aired on July 4th, 2001, essentially nothing happened. There were no protests. There were no phone calls to the network. There were no statements from Muslim advocacy organizations. There were no threatened boycotts, no angry letters, no follow-up coverage from media outlets that cover religious sensitivities. The episode just aired. People watched it. The regulars enjoyed it. Reviews noted the Abraham Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth sequence as a highlight. Season 5 was being well received generally. Life moved on. Muhammad appeared in the opening title sequence as part of the crowd of characters. Nobody said anything about that either. The episode stayed in regular rotation for years after its initial broadcast. It was included in its entirety in the South Park. The complete 5th season, DVD release in 2005, with no special content warnings, no additional framing, no acknowledgement that it was anything other than another episode of South Park. You could buy it at any video store and watch Muhammad flying with fire powers alongside Buddha and Moses and the rest of them, and nothing would happen because nothing was happening. Then on September 30th, 2005, a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten, published in the city of Aarhus, ran 12 editorial cartoons depicting Muhammad on its culture pages. The stated purpose was to push back against what the paper's culture editor described as a growing culture of self-censorship in Western media around the subject of Islam. The specific trigger was a Danish author who had been struggling to find illustrators willing to draw Muhammad for a children's book about the Prophet's life. Artists in Denmark, the editor believed, were afraid of reprisals, and he wanted to demonstrate that a newspaper would not be afraid. He commissioned the cartoons and published them. Several of the cartoons were relatively benign. Some were pointed, but not much more inflammatory than the average political cartoon about any other public figure. One depicted Muhammad with a turban shaped like a bomb with a lit fuse, which was meant, the artist later explained, not as a statement about Islam generally, but about the specific strand of violent extremism that had been conducted in the Prophet's name. The interpretation, however, was not universally generous. Muslim organizations in Denmark filed formal complaints. The Danish Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, described the situation in remarkably strong terms as the worst international relations crisis Denmark had faced since World War II, which is a sentence that says something about the magnitude of what was building. He refused to meet with diplomatic representatives from Muslim countries who were seeking to address the issue, citing the legal principle that the Danish government could not intervene in what a newspaper chose to publish. In late January and early February 2006, the accumulated pressure erupted into something that left a permanent mark on the world. Danish embassies in Damascus, Beirut, and Tehran were set on fire. Protests spread across the Middle East, across parts of Africa, across South Asia and Southeast Asia. In the formal count, at least 139 people died in the unrest, with higher estimates reaching close to 250. Cartoonists received death threats of varying degrees of specificity. The newspaper received bomb threats. Multiple cartoonists were placed under permanent security protection. One of them would be attacked in his home in 2010 by a man with a knife and an axe who broke through his front door while his grandchildren were visiting. The cartoonist survived only because he had a reinforced panic room installed specifically for situations like this. The world had demonstrated something it had been building toward for years. The depiction of Muhammad in visual media carried stakes that were different in kind from the depiction of any other religious figure in the Western world. Not because the religion demanded more respect in principle, but because some people were willing to respond to certain depictions with lethal violence. And the threat of that violence was sufficient to change the behavior of institutions that would otherwise have applied consistent standards. South Park had been living and working in a world where Muhammad could appear in a cartoon without consequence. In that world, Super Best Friends was just an episode. And then, between July 4th and September 30th of a particular year, that world ceased to exist around the episode while the episode itself remained exactly as it had been. Comedy Central pulled it Super Best Friends from its rerun rotation during the Danish cartoon's fallout in 2006. They removed it from the official South Park website. The DVD stayed in stores, and the episode on that disc didn't change. But in the places where most people found and watched the show, it disappeared. Here is the quality of this particular situation that I find impossible to stop thinking about. The episode was not changed. Not a frame of animation was altered. Muhammad's portrayal in Super Best Friends was exactly as it had been when the episode first aired. Heroic, positive, a superhero who helped his friends save the world. Nothing in the content of the episode was newly offensive. The content had been the same for 5 years. What had changed was the world around the episode. Events that had no connection to South Park, that Parker and Stone had nothing to do with, that predated many of the conversations the show was trying to have, had fundamentally altered what it meant for the image of Muhammad to exist in a cartoon. An image that communicated respect and affection in 2001 had become, through no fault of its own, a potential flashpoint in 2006. Not because of what it said, because of what was happening in the world. Super Best Friends was collateral damage in a war it hadn't started and hadn't contributed to. It became dangerous not because of anything it contained, but because of what external events had turned its existence into. And that quality of an episode becoming retroactively controversial through no act of its own is one of the strangest and most philosophically interesting things about South Park's banned episode history. The episode had always been good. The episode had always depicted Muhammad in a favorable light. The episode had always been made with more care and affection for its subject than most of what passes for religious commentary on television. And none of that mattered because the world had moved to a place where the image itself, regardless of context, regardless of intent, regardless of the warmth with which it was rendered, was no longer safe to broadcast. That is what a banned episode looks like when the ban is created not by the content but by the circumstances around the content. The show didn't do anything wrong. The world just changed shape around it, and the show's old work fit differently in the new shape. Part 3. The show that spent 2005 and 2006 at the edge of everything? The year 2005 was genuinely one of the most significant in South Park's history, and it's useful to understand just how much was converging at once. The Danish cartoons controversy was building in the fall. The show was approaching its 200th episode in the years ahead. And in November 2005, Trey Parker and Matt Stone made an episode that became one of the most technically brilliant and emotionally complicated things the show had ever produced, while simultaneously setting off a chain reaction that would cost them their most beloved cast member. Season 9, Episode 12. November 16th, 2005. Trapped in the closet. The setup is constructed with the kind of casual-seeming genius that Parker and Stone make look effortless. Stan Marsh, walking past a Scientology location while trying to find something fun and free to do, is invited in for a free personality test. He takes it. The machine that measures his readings, an e-meter, a real device used in actual Scientology practice, produces numbers the auditor has never seen before. The president of Scientology is called. He looks at the numbers. Stan's thetan levels, which are the energy units the church uses to measure spiritual potential and personal worth, are not just high. They are the highest ever recorded. The only person in Scientology's history whose readings matched these was L. Ron Hubbard, the science fiction writer who founded the church in 1953. Stan, the church determines, must be the reincarnation of Hubbard. He is the new prophet. The news travels fast in Scientology's hierarchy. Word reaches Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise comes to Stan's house. He sits down across from this 9-year-old in a Colorado mountain town and asks him the question that has clearly been burning in him for some time. He asks Stan what he really thinks of his movies. Not the polite answer, the real one. Stan, being Stan, gives the real one. He thinks the movies are okay. Not great. Solid. Somewhere in the middle of the range of films he's seen. He delivers this assessment with the flat matter-of-factness of a child who has not yet learned that sometimes people don't actually want the answer to the questions they ask. Tom Cruise is devastated. He walks into Stan's closet and closes the door and refuses to come out. This is the premise from which the entire episode operates, and it operates it with a sustained, layered brilliance that makes it stand apart. Every scene is constructed around the phrase, Tom Cruise won't come out of the closet, and the phrase does double and triple work in every instance. There's the literal meaning, an adult man has locked himself in a child's room and won't leave. There's the obvious secondary meaning, deployed mercilessly but without ever stating it directly. The metaphor of someone hiding something about their sexuality. And there's a third layer that the episode earns over time, which is about the way that power and fame and institutional belonging can make a person into something that can no longer tolerate honest criticism. John Travolta, another prominent Scientologist, comes to try to coax Cruise out. He ends up in the closet too. R. Kelly arrives, singing in his signature style that was, at that moment, enormously famous due to his serialized video project Trapped in the Closet, and he ends up in the closet as well. Stan is left outside trying to deal with the consequences of having told a famous person the truth about his movies. Meanwhile, the other half of the episode is doing something with considerably more sharp edges. The president of the Scientology organization sits Stan down and explains the actual, doctrinal, genuinely believed cosmology of the church. The story of Xenu, the galactic ruler of the Galactic Confederacy, who 75 million years ago transported billions of beings to Earth, stacked them around volcanoes, and detonated hydrogen bombs. The spirits of those beings, which Scientology calls body thetans, clung to the surviving life forms and have been causing human suffering ever since. The church presents itself as the organization that can help you free yourself from these body thetans through a process called auditing, which costs money. The episode presents all of this with a single, remarkable text caption at the bottom of the screen. This is what Scientologists actually believe. That caption is one of the most precise and effective editorial choices in the show's history. It's not editorializing, it's not mocking in the way that cruelty mocks. It's stating, flatly, that this is doctrine. This is what the church teaches. This is what the church's most prominent celebrity members believe. And that belief is presented here in full, without cuts or softening, and the audience can assess it for themselves. Nobody had done this before, not on American television at any kind of scale. The Church of Scientology was famously litigious. They had a documented and extensive history of pursuing legal action against anyone who disclosed their teachings or criticized their practices. Attempts to do Scientology-focused content on other shows had been shut down before reaching broadcast. Penn Jillette had tried to make a Scientology episode of his show on Showtime and had been prohibited by the network. The church had successfully created a kind of ring of institutional caution around itself in Hollywood. Parker and Stone's 6-day production schedule was a kind of protection against the slowest form of legal interference. By the time any organization could mount a serious legal response to an episode in development, the episode had already aired. The writing was done on Monday. The animation was completed through Wednesday and Thursday. It aired the following week. There was no development window long enough for a legal filing to make the episode disappear before it broadcast. And so the show credited everyone involved in the episode, including Parker and Stone themselves, as either John Smith or Jane Smith. The entire production was anonymous in the credits. The joke at the end, where Stan dares Scientology to sue him, was a reflection of the actual legal calculus the creators had done. Parker said in a later interview that Matt Stone's membership had kept them from making a proper Scientology episode for years. He said you can only hear "you can't do that" so many times before the words lose their power to stop you. And eventually they just did it. The rebroadcast pullback, what the media called Closet Gate, came in March 2006. The episode had aired in November 2005 and been received with enormous enthusiasm. It was scheduled for a rebroadcast on March 15, 2006. Comedy Central canceled the rebroadcast without prior notice, replacing it with a repeat of an older episode. The network's explanation: it was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had announced his departure from the show 2 days earlier. Multiple media outlets at the time reported a different version. The story, widely covered, was that Tom Cruise had communicated that he would be unwilling to promote Mission: Impossible 3 unless the episode was pulled. Mission: Impossible 3 was being distributed by Paramount Pictures. Paramount was owned by Viacom. Viacom also owned Comedy Central. The same parent company that broadcast South Park was about to release a major franchise film starring the person South Park had just satirized in its highest-profile episode, and that person was reportedly applying leverage through the most effective channel available to him. Cruise's representatives denied the story. Comedy Central declined to comment substantively. Parker and Stone issued a statement they signed, "Trey Parker and Matt Stone, servants of the Dark Lord Xenu." But the Isaac Hayes story, the real one, is the one that deserves a long, slow look. Because it is not the story of a principled man protesting content he found objectionable. It is the story of what happens when institutions make decisions for people who can no longer make them for themselves. Isaac Hayes had been voicing Chef, the school cafeteria worker, since the very first episode in 1997. For 9 years, he had given the character a warmth and a dignity and a musical flair that made Chef unlike anything else in the show. Chef was the adult the children could actually talk to. Chef understood things that the other adults in South Park were too self-absorbed or too stupid or too compromised to understand. He was, in a show full of grotesque characters and deliberate cruelty, a figure of genuine affection. Hayes gave him soul. In March 2006, a press release was issued under Hayes' name. It stated that satire had a place in the world, but that a line existed between satire and intolerance toward religious beliefs, and that his faith demanded he not continue associating with a program that crossed that line. He was leaving South Park. Chef was being retired. Matt Stone's response was characteristically unvarnished. He said this was completely about Scientology. He observed that Hayes had cashed plenty of checks from South Park for 9 years while the show made fun of Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, Catholicism, Buddhism, and every other major religion on Earth, and had never raised a word of objection. The specific episode that prompted the departure was the one about his specific faith. But here's what Stone and Parker came to understand in the years that followed. In January 2006, before the departure was ever announced, Hayes had suffered a serious stroke. He lost the ability to speak. He was in no condition to make decisions, or issue press releases, or manage his professional relationships, or exercise any kind of agency at all over his own life. He required intensive care. And every person around him at that time, his assistants, his publicists, his management, all of them were practicing Scientologists. In 2016, Hayes' son Isaac Hayes III spoke directly to The Hollywood Reporter as part of an oral history of the show. He said, "My dad did not quit South Park. Someone quit South Park for him." He said that at the time the press release was issued, his father was incapable of making that decision, incapable of writing those words, incapable of directing anyone to act on his behalf in any professional matter. The people around him, who were supposed to be protecting him, made the choice to sever his connection to the show, and they did it using his name and his public persona. And then they sent the press release into the world as if it were his. Hayes died on August 10, 2008 from a second stroke. He was 75 years old. He had never fully recovered from the first one. He never got to speak for himself on what had happened. He never got to reconcile with Parker and Stone. He never got to address the circumstances of his departure. He was gone before the full truth of what had been done to him became clear enough to tell. The show dedicated a season 12 episode to his memory. Parker and Stone, in that same 2016 Hollywood Reporter oral history, confirmed that they believed Hayes III's account completely, and that the picture he described matched what they had eventually pieced together on their own. What followed Hayes' departure, the episode Parker and Stone made in direct response, the one that used spliced audio clips of Hayes' previous recordings to have Chef speak new sentences he'd never actually said, that ended with Chef being killed in extraordinarily graphic fashion by lightning and fire and wild animals before being resurrected as a robotic, Darth Vader-influenced villain, is one of the more genuinely sad things in South Park's history when you know what was actually happening. It was a misdirected response to a situation that was far more human and far more complicated than anyone in the writer's room understood at the time. They were fighting an institution. The person they thought was fighting them had already been taken from the fight by the institution. And they aimed at the institution through the only vehicle they had, which was the character, and the character died. And the truth didn't come out for another decade. Part 4. Cartoon Wars. The 2 episodes that turned the camera on the cameraman. April 5th, 2006. Season 10, Episode 3. Cartoon Wars Part 1. Parker and Stone had been developing this episode for months. They had originally wanted it to open the entire season. Disagreements with Comedy Central over the depiction of Muhammad had forced them to push it back. The season opened instead with The Return of Chef, which addressed the Hayes situation, and then several weeks later, the Cartoon Wars 2-parter aired. The setting is the fictional world of South Park, Colorado. A news bulletin has appeared. The animated series Family Guy is planning to broadcast an episode that will include an uncensored visual depiction of Muhammad. The entire town panics immediately. People run into the community center for shelter. Randy Marsh delivers the news to the assembled crowd, and the consensus response is that everyone should bury their heads in the sand. Literally. There's a sequence where citizens are digging holes and inserting their heads to demonstrate that they weren't watching and aren't involved. This is the kind of sequence that works on 2 levels simultaneously, and neither level is subtle. On the surface, it's absurd comedy, adults digging holes in their front yards to hide their heads. One step back, it's a precise description of the social mechanism of institutional cowardice, the way that organizations and governments and networks respond to threats by finding ways to not technically be present for what's happening, by creating procedural distance between themselves and the thing they're afraid of. Burying your head in the sand, not metaphorically, as policy. Cartman, who despises Family Guy with a personal intensity that goes beyond any principled concern, sees an opportunity. If Muslim extremists are threatening violence over this episode, and if the episode's airing can be prevented, then Family Guy might be canceled. He presents himself as someone motivated entirely by sensitivity and concern for Muslim viewers. He is not. He is motivated by petty personal grievance. but he wraps the petty personal grievance in the exact language of sensitivity and protection that would be used by someone with genuine concerns. Kaladali, who likes Family Guy and believes in the right of the show to air what it wants to air, sees through Cartman immediately. He knows Cartman doesn't care about Muslims. He knows this is about the feud. And so the episode establishes its central conflict as one between two positions that the show then complicates deliberately. The position that the image should be shown because free expression requires equal treatment, and the position that the image should be suppressed because people might get hurt. Cartman asks Kyle, if 10 people die because Family Guy had to have their little joke, will it still be funny then? And Kyle has no answer. That silence matters, because the argument embedded in Cartman's question is not, as a philosophical matter, without weight. It is the argument that has been used to justify every act of censorship that has ever succeeded. The stakes are too high. The consequences are too severe. People will be harmed. Is any joke worth that? The honest response, the one that doesn't collapse under its own weight, requires accepting something genuinely uncomfortable. That the right to expression cannot be made conditional on whether violent people will respond to it with violence. Because if it can be made conditional on that, then violence has been permanently handed editorial control over public discourse. The organization that is most willing to be the most threatening gets to decide what gets said. And the content that survives is only the content that threatens nobody. Which is to say, the content that says nothing. But that response, honest as it is, requires accepting that expression is sometimes worth a cost. And the cost isn't abstract. It's not theoretical. It's real people, some of whom haven't done anything, who might be in the wrong place at the wrong time when someone who is angry about a cartoon acts on that anger. Cartoon Wars does not pretend this is a simple argument. It puts the complicated argument on screen and lets it sit there, uncomfortable. Cartman gets Kyle to go with him to Hollywood because Kyle can't answer the question. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because answering it honestly means sitting with a difficult truth. While all this is happening in the fictional world of South Park, Parker and Stone were living it in their actual production building. They had been in negotiations with Comedy Central for months about whether the network would allow them to show an image of Muhammad in the episode. The image they wanted to use was straightforward: Muhammad, standing in a scene, handing Peter Griffin a football helmet. Not mocking, not degrading, not doing anything particularly notable, just present the way any character is present in a scene. Comedy Central refused. What aired in Cartoon Wars Part 2, in the moment where the Family Guy episode within the show reveals Muhammad, was a black title card reading, Comedy Central has refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad on their network. Parker and Stone had written this exact scenario into the episode. A fictional network refuses to allow a cartoon depiction of Muhammad, and the show comments on that refusal and its implications. And then the actual network refused to allow the actual cartoon's actual depiction of Muhammad, and the text card was precisely what they had scripted, except that it had moved from the fictional level to the real one. The fiction became the reality in the time it took to transmit the finished episode to broadcast. It is genuinely difficult to think of another moment in the history of American television where a show's satirical premise was so completely and immediately confirmed by the act of broadcast itself. The episode was about censorship. It was censored. The argument the episode was making was proven true by the conditions of its own airing. And then, in the scene that followed, Comedy Central allowed the show to broadcast a sequence in which Jesus Christ and George W. Bush defecated on each other and on the American flag. The sequence aired without any objection, any bleeping, any black title card, any statement from the network. You can show Jesus doing the most deliberately degrading thing the show's writers could conceive to the sitting president of the United States and the national symbol. You cannot show Muhammad handing someone a helmet. Parker and Stone made that contrast explicit, deliberately, visually. The double standard is not subtext, it is the point of the scene. The show demonstrates the double standard by being the subject of the double standard while demonstrating it. When Parker and Stone asked Comedy Central about the decision, the network didn't claim religious sensitivity. They didn't frame it as a question of respect. They said honestly that they were afraid of being bombed. They were afraid that broadcasting an image of Muhammad would make their offices targets for physical violence, and they were not willing to accept that risk. This is a more honest answer than the one they might have given. It acknowledges that the fear is real and that the calculation is material rather than principled. It doesn't dress up institutional cowardice as moral leadership. It is simply, we are afraid and we are doing what afraid people do. Parker and Stone's response to this, expressed in various ways across many interviews, was that fear is a terrible basis for editorial policy, specifically because fear can be manufactured. If an organization can make a network afraid by publishing threatening content, and the network's fear then determines what television audiences can see, then the organization has acquired editorial power it was never supposed to have. The mechanism for acquiring that power is the threat of violence. And if that mechanism works, and it will be used again, and what gets broadcast will increasingly be determined by who is most willing to threaten, rather than who has the most legitimate claim on public attention. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, called the Cartoon Wars episodes funny and accurate. He appeared to genuinely appreciate what the show was doing, even though it was simultaneously being fairly savage about his show's writing style. The critique of Family Guy that runs through the two-parter, that it uses random, disconnected jokes without narrative logic while South Park constructs jokes that emerge from its characters and situations, is a creative argument that MacFarlane apparently took seriously rather than personally. Parker and Stone reflected later that the conversation following Cartoon Wars had focused primarily on the South Park versus Family Guy feud, rather than on the censorship argument. People wanted to debate which show was funnier. They wanted to discuss the mechanics of cartoon writing and whether Family Guy's style was inherently inferior to South Park's. They did not want to sit with the question of whether a network's fear of violence should determine what images can appear on American television. The entertainment controversy consumed the space that the free expression debate might have occupied. This, Parker noted, was its own form of the censorship working. The real conversation had been redirected. The interesting argument had been buried under a more comfortable, more manageable argument about show quality. And that is exactly what censorship is designed to do. Replace the conversation you're not supposed to have with one that's acceptable. Both parts of Cartoon Wars are now banned. They cannot be streamed on Paramount+. They are not available for digital purchase through any major platform. The episodes that argued against censorship and were censored in the process of making that argument have been permanently removed from the legal viewing record by the same kind of decision they were critiquing. Part 5: The World. Between 2006 and 2010, how history sets a stage. Let's take a breath and sit with the years between Cartoon Wars and what comes next. Because the atmosphere of those years is not background, it is the stage on which the following acts are performed, and understanding it changes how you hear the music. After the Danish cartoons controversy and the Cartoon Wars episodes, Comedy Central had made its position explicit. Muhammad would not appear on screen. The show had depicted every other major religious figure imaginable. Jesus lived in South Park. Buddha appeared in episodes with various behavioral issues. Joseph Smith was depicted as a genuinely decent man with an extremely strange origin story. The Virgin Mary bled in ways that generated international boycott campaigns. God appeared as a small animal that could barely speak above a whisper. All of this aired. All of it was criticized by someone. None of it resulted in Comedy Central placing a black title card over a scene. But Muhammad was different, and the difference was not theological. It was not a statement about comparative spiritual worth. It was a statement about the specific material reality that some people had demonstrated they were willing to respond to certain depictions with lethal force, and the threat of that force was sufficient to change the behavior of institutions that would otherwise have applied consistent editorial standards. The world between 2006 and 2010 saw this dynamic become more visible and more complicated, not less. The Gillen's Poston cartoonists were living under security arrangements that most people associate with political figures in war zones. Kurt Westergaard, who had drawn the most famous of the cartoons, the one with the bomb turban, was attacked in his home on January 1, 2010, 3 months before episode 200 aired. The attacker broke through his front door with a knife and an axe. Westergaard, who was 75 years old, made it to a reinforced panic room he'd had installed for exactly this scenario and locked the door and waited while his grandchildren were elsewhere in the house. The attacker was shot and wounded when police arrived. Westergaard survived. This was the world in which Parker and Stone were making their 200th episode. They weren't naive about what they were walking into. Cartoon Wars had shown them exactly where the line was and exactly what happened when you approached it. They had been in direct, on-record negotiations with Comedy Central about the depiction of Muhammad and had lost those negotiations. They had watched the network prove their satirical argument by censoring the satire that was making it. They had then continued making South Park for 4 more seasons while the Muhammad question sat unresolved, because the next episode was always waiting. The 200th episode would be enormous by the logic of the show's history. Parker and Stone were known for treating milestone episodes as occasions for genuine creative ambition. The concept they developed for episode 200 was, in its structure, a celebration of 20 years of television history and simultaneously a return to the unfinished argument from 2006. The 200th episode of South Park would directly engage with the question of whether Muhammad could appear on screen. But it would do it in a way that made the question itself the subject of the episode. Not just a plot element, the engine of the whole thing. And in preparing to make this episode, Parker and Stone understood, clearly, that they were stepping back into territory where the stakes had been real before and would be real again. Part 6, Episode 200, the celebration that became a crisis. April 14, 2010, Season 14, Episode 5, simply titled 200. The episode's opening is deceptively mundane. Mr. Garrison's class is on a field trip to a chocolate factory. Butters notices Tom Cruise working on the packaging line, packing fudge into boxes with the focused energy of someone who has found their calling. Stan, who had once told Tom Cruise that his movies were just okay and trapped in the closet, calls out to him the obvious description. Cruise is literally packing fudge. He's a fudge packer. Stan says so. Tom Cruise hears a completely different sentence. He storms off. He is on the phone within minutes. He has a list. The list consists of every celebrity South Park has ever mocked, satirized, or depicted unfavorably, and there are hundreds of them. They assemble at Cruise's house in a sequence that is both extraordinarily funny and a genuine piece of South Park history. Rob Reiner, Barbara Streisand, who had been turned into a giant kaiju robot in Season 1 and apparently never forgave the town. Kanye West, Paris Hilton, Michael Bay, O.J. Simpson, Mel Gibson, George Lucas, and Steven Spielberg, who the show had depicted in a notorious Season 12 episode assaulting Indiana Jones, Ben Affleck, and dozens more. Every person who had sat in the writer's room as the subject of a segment or a joke or a running gag for 14 seasons gathered together in one place, organized and motivated. Cruise leads them. They will file a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park for all the slander, defamation, and general cruelty they have collectively suffered. The town will be bankrupted. South Park will cease to exist. There is a way out of the lawsuit. Tom Cruise will drop the whole thing under one condition. He wants to meet Muhammad. The joke here is both simple and perfectly aimed. The only entity in the show's universe that cannot be ridiculed is Muhammad, because ridiculing Muhammad has in the real world outside the show's fiction produced consequences that nothing else has produced. Cruise wants what violence has given Muhammad's image: immunity from satire. He believes there is something Muhammad possesses, something Cruise calls a goo, that makes ridicule impossible, and he wants it. The entire premise of the episode is a brilliant reformulation of the argument from Cartoon Wars. The 200th episode is asking, what does it mean that one religious figure has been given practical immunity from satire through the credible threat of violence? What does that immunity look like mapped onto the world of the show? And the answer is, it looks like the most powerful thing in the universe. It looks like something every celebrity who has ever been mocked would kill to have. The plan to get Muhammad to South Park involves Stan and Kyle going to the Hall of Super Best Friends and asking him to come back. The team is reluctant. The world has changed since 2001. Showing Muhammad openly would be dangerous in ways it hadn't been then. He travels in a sealed U-Haul truck. Nobody can see him. When the Ginger Kids, a separate faction who want Muhammad's power for themselves, demand proof that the person in the truck is actually Muhammad, the townspeople reveal that they've substituted Santa Claus in a bear suit. The bear suit choice is not accidental. It directly references the 2007 incident in Sudan in which a British schoolteacher named Gillian Gibbons was arrested and faced calls for execution after allowing her students to name a classroom Teddy Bear Muhammad. The bear carries that history. Mecca Streisand is rebuilt and deployed against the town in the cliffhanger that ends episode 200. The celebrities are furious. The Gingers are armed. Cartman's hand puppet persona Mitch Connor is maneuvering for personal advantage in the chaos. And the question of Cartman's actual father, a mystery that the show had technically resolved years earlier, but that episode 200 reopens through a new avenue, is still hanging in the air. Episode 200 was seen by 3.33 million viewers. By any measure, it was among the show's most watched episodes. It received immediate and widespread critical acclaim. Its IMDb rating sits at 8.8. Both it and its follow-up were nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in 2010. And then the week passed between broadcast, and on a website operated by a New York-based organization called Revolution Muslim, a post appeared. Part 7. The Threats, and the Worst Week in South Park's History. Zachary Adam Chesser was 20 years old in April 2010. He had grown up in a suburb of Washington, attended a well-regarded high school in Northern Virginia, played on the crew team, studied Japanese, and by all external accounts had lived the kind of ordinary suburban life that produces people who go on to do ordinary suburban things. He had converted to Islam. He had become affiliated with Revolution Muslim, a small organization based in New York that maintained a website and organized occasional public protests, and used the internet to distribute content that its creators described as an Islamic response to Western cultural imperialism. Revolution Muslim had approximately 12 active members at its peak. It was, as a physical organization, tiny. Its website, however, reached a much larger audience, and it had attracted the attention of counterterrorism agencies for its rhetoric about violent jihad and its expressed support for al-Qaeda's positions. Chesser, who used the online name Abu Talha al-Amriki, wrote a post about episode 200 of South Park. The post stated that Matt Stone and Trey Parker would probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for what they had done in the episode. Theo Van Gogh was a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in Amsterdam on November 2, 2004. He had made a short film called Submission about the treatment of women in certain Islamic societies, a film written by the Somali-Dutch activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. The day after the film was broadcast on Dutch television, Van Gogh was cycling to work when a man shot him from a bicycle, then jumped off and stabbed him multiple times, attempted to decapitate him, and pinned a note to his chest with a knife. The note contained threats to Hirsi Ali and to Western governments. The murderer was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Chesser's post included a photograph of Van Gogh's body at the crime scene. It included the physical addresses of Comedy Central's office in New York and the production company in Los Angeles. It included links to audio recordings of an al-Qaeda imam calling for the assassination of people who had defamed Muhammad. It included a link to a 2009 newspaper article that gave details about the location of Stone and Parker's private residence in Colorado. And Chesser maintained, in a subsequent interview, that the post was not a threat. It was a warning. A prediction of what would likely happen. The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's New York offices immediately after the post was published. The FBI opened an investigation. The Anti-Defamation League, which had been monitoring Revolution Muslim since its founding, confirmed the threatening nature of the content and the post as consistent with a broader pattern of rhetoric from the organization. On April 21, 2010, episode 201 aired. It was not the episode Parker and Stone had made. Comedy Central, without consulting the creators, made alterations to the finished product that were extensive and deliberate. Every instance of Muhammad's name in the audio track was replaced with a bleep. All visual representations of what appeared to be Muhammad were covered by a black box labeled Censored. And the episode's final scene, in which Kyle delivers the traditional South Park closing speech, was buried under a continuous bleep tone that lasted roughly 35 seconds and covered every word of it. Parker and Stone found out their episode had been changed when they watched it air. They had not been consulted. They had not been asked for approval. They had not been given the opportunity to adjust the material or discuss alternatives. The finished product they had delivered to the network had been altered by the network, and they learned about the alterations the same way the audience did. South Park Studios posted a statement the morning after broadcast. It read, in part, "In the 14 years we've been doing South Park, we have never done a show that we couldn't stand behind. We delivered our version of the show to Comedy Central, and they made a determination to alter the episode. It wasn't some meta joke on our part. Comedy Central added the bleeps. In fact, Kyle's customary final speech was about intimidation and fear. It didn't mention Muhammad at all, but it got bleeped too. Kyle's speech, which was written about the dynamic that the censorship was now demonstrating, stated that the power of threatening people with violence was the only true power, that terrorizing people works, and that what had been shown through the whole ordeal was that fear determines what gets broadcast. Those words were censored because Comedy Central was afraid of violence. The speech that said fear was the mechanism for controlling expression was suppressed by the mechanism of controlling expression through fear. The proof and the suppression were the same action. Comedy Central confirmed they were responsible for the censorship. They did not deny it. They said they had been afraid. They had been afraid that broadcasting the episode as made would put their employees at physical risk. Trey Parker, according to a 2016 Hollywood Reporter oral history, was so furious that he purchased a one-way airline ticket to South Africa and showed it to the head of the network as a statement. He did not go to South Africa, but he bought the ticket. Dave Chappelle had fled to South Africa in 2005 during his own crisis with his network, and Parker's ticket was a pointed reference. I know what it looks like when a creator has been pushed too far by an institution that controls their work. The New York Police Department maintained heightened security around Comedy Central's buildings. On May 1st, 10 days after episode 201 aired, a car bomb was found and disabled in Times Square. Congressman Peter King publicly suggested the South Park controversy might have been a contributing factor in the motivation for the attack. Subsequent investigation determined the suspect had been planning the attack for months before episode 200 aired. Revolution Muslim denied any connection. NYPD Commissioner Raymond Kelly said the theory was not ruled out. The situation, briefly, was that a sitting congressman was drawing a line between a cartoon and a near-mass casualty incident in one of the most crowded public spaces in the world. Zachary Chesser was arrested in July 2010, not initially on charges related to South Park, but for attempting to provide material support to Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization in Somalia. He pleaded guilty to that charge and to charges including communicating threats. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Jesse Curtis Morton, the co-founder of Revolution Muslim who had worked with Chesser on the response to South Park, was separately arrested and sentenced to more than 11 years for related offenses. The investigation into Revolution Muslim revealed connections to multiple terrorism cases in the United States and elsewhere. Both episodes, 200 and 201, were pulled from Comedy Central's website. They were removed from every streaming service. The Season 14 DVD release includes both episodes in their censored forms, preceded by a text card noting that they are presented as they originally aired. The commentary tracks on those DVDs feature Parker saying they delivered the episode as intended and sent it in, followed by a continuous bleep that covers most of what he says next, and then Stone saying, "Yeah, that's about right." They refer to Muhammad only as the prophet of the Muslim faith in the commentary. His name does not appear on the disc in any unsuppressed form. The uncensored version of episode 201 does not exist on any official platform and has never been officially released. In January 2014, a technically sophisticated user on the website 4chan discovered that Comedy Central's own web server still contained the original file, accessible through a technical method involving a piece of software called RTMP dump. The uncensored file was downloaded and distributed online. Comedy Central did not acknowledge this officially. The file has continued to circulate in the informal archive of the internet, appearing and disappearing as content claims land and are worked around. The text of Kyle's speech became widely known after this and has been quoted in numerous pieces of journalism and commentary in the years since. It remains officially censored. The bleep is still on the disc. The censored bar is still in the frame. 14 years later, Part 8. What the 5 episodes mean together. When you lay the 5 banned episodes out in order, their dates and their circumstances, and their specific relationship to each other, a single thread becomes visible that runs through all of them. Super Best Friends aired on July 4th, 2001. Muhammad appeared as a superhero. Nobody objected. The world was one shape. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2 aired on April 5th and April 12th, 2006. They argued that the double standard around Muhammad's depiction was wrong. They were censored in the act of making that argument. The world had become a different shape. Episodes 200 and 201 aired on April 14th and April 21st, 2010. They returned to the question directly in the landmark 200th episode format, and the response was death threats and the most extensive censorship in the show's history, and the conviction of the person who made the threats on federal charges. 9 years? 5 episodes. One argument. The depiction of Muhammad should be subject to the same editorial standards as the depiction of everyone else. Not for the purpose of being provocative, not for the purpose of mocking or degrading. For the purpose of not allowing fear to determine what can exist in the cultural record. The argument was not won. The 5 episodes are still gone. The speech is still officially bleeped. The image of Muhammad handing Peter Griffin a football helmet was never broadcast. The image of Muhammad standing there, just standing there in the way he stood in Super Best Friends in 2001 when the world was a different shape, has not been seen legally since then. Comedy Central's decision in each case was motivated by real, material, understandable fear. The people in those New York offices had families. They had ordinary human vulnerability. The addresses of the buildings where they worked were being published online by people who were explicitly invoking the murder of a European filmmaker as an illustration of what should happen next. The fear was not invented. It was earned. And yet, what the fear produced in terms of outcomes was exactly what the threatening content was designed to produce. The episodes were suppressed. The speech was censored. The images were hidden. The people who published the addresses of the network's offices and said, "This is what will happen to you if you broadcast this," were in the outcome correct that broadcasting it had costs. And the costs arrived through the network's own response to the threats, rather than through any violence the threats enabled. This is the truly difficult part of the banned episode's story. The violence didn't happen, the office wasn't bombed, Parker and Stone weren't harmed. The man who made the threats was arrested and imprisoned. By any measure of direct harm, the situation resolved in the best way it could have. Nobody died over South Park episode 200, but the episodes are still gone. The argument is still officially unfinished. The question of whether an image can be shown, which the show was specifically trying to address, is still answered in the negative on every legal streaming platform. The threat succeeded not through violence, but through fear of violence. And the distinction between violence and the threat of violence, however meaningful it is legally and morally, does not change the outcome for the 5 episodes. Part 9, The Ghost in the Archive. There's a particular quality to cultural objects that exist only partially. The uncensored version of episode 201 is one of them. It lives in the internet's informal ecosystem, appearing in screen recordings and archived files that surface and get removed and resurface on different platforms, always slightly bootleg, always slightly sideways from the legal record. Watching it has a specific feeling that's hard to describe precisely. It's not quite the feeling of watching contraband because the content itself is not by any reasonable standard harmful. It's more like reading a letter that was opened by someone else before it reached you. The message is exactly as it was written, but it has passed through hands it wasn't supposed to pass through, and that passage has left a quality on it. Kyle's speech, in the uncensored version, is not shocking to read or hear. It is a television speech, written in the brisk, deliberately simple style that South Park uses for its closing moral statements, about a point the show had been making since Cartoon Wars. The language is not complex, the sentences are short. This is a show written in 6 days, not workshopped across months for rhetorical elegance. But the simplicity lands. The power of threatening people with violence is the only true power. If there's anything we've all learned, it's that terrorizing people works. Kyle says this in the show's fiction, in response to Tom Cruise asking why the censored bar over Muhammad disappeared once people started mocking Cruise again. It's a neat piece of construction. The mechanism that had been protecting Muhammad, which the episode frames as the mechanism of fear, dissolves when the fear dissolves, and what's left is the ordinary ridicule that South Park applies to everything. The point being that the protection was never special. It was situational. It was produced by a specific dynamic, and that dynamic was the willingness to threaten violence. When Kyle gives this speech in the uncensored version, there is a quality to it, given everything that happened around the episode, that goes beyond the show's usual blend of absurdity and genuine moral inquiry. A cartoon child is telling you that his network's fear is what gave the threatening organization its power over what you're allowed to see. And the network censored the cartoon child saying that, and the censorship proved the cartoon child correct. Super Best Friends is, of the 5, the one that sits most quietly in its unavailability. It is a warm episode. It is one of the better Stan and Kyle friendship episodes the show produced in its earlier seasons. The ending, where Kyle tells Stan that Stan is his super best friend and Stan says the same, is genuinely sweet in the specific way that South Park manages sweetness, which is to say it arrives quickly and without announcement, and is almost immediately undercut by Cartman getting kicked in the crotch for being Cartman. The sweetness is real and the undercutting is real, and they coexist without either canceling the other. That episode is unavailable. The sweet one. The one where Muhammad is a superhero. The one that aired in 2001 without a single complaint and got quietly banned by association 9 years later because the world it existed in had been replaced by a world it didn't fit. There is an argument to be made that the ongoing unavailability of these 5 episodes is itself a kind of speech. A continuous statement made by its persistence across years and streaming transitions and corporate restructurings that the mechanism which made them unavailable has not been superseded. That the fear is still there, or a version of it, or at least a determination to not revisit the decision and potentially reopen the conversation. The episodes stay gone because the problem that made them go has not been resolved. It has just become quiet. Part 10. The Long View. 3 decades of talking to the wall. South Park has been making episodes for nearly 3 decades. In that time, it has been condemned by the Catholic League, by Scientology, by the Chinese government, by various branches of the American federal government, by individual celebrities with lawyers, by parent councils, by school administrators, by foreign governments, by religious leaders of multiple faiths on multiple continents, by the White House of the United States of America. The season 27 premiere in July 2025 drew an official White House statement within 24 hours calling the show fourth-rate and claiming it hadn't been relevant in over 20 years. The episode that prompted the White House statement drew 6.2 million multi-platform viewers in its first 3 days, the highest live ratings for Comedy Central since 2018. This is the pattern that defines South Park's relationship with institutional power. The institution reacts. The reaction creates attention. The attention creates viewers. The viewers prove that the show is exactly as relevant as the institution was trying to say it wasn't. The White House, in condemning South Park for being irrelevant, produced the single most effective advertisement for the season premiere that anyone could have designed. Trey Parker's response at Comic-Con the day after the White House issued its statement was to pause, look at the camera for approximately 5 seconds and say, "We're terribly sorry." It is the same response he and Stone gave to China after being banned from the Chinese internet following the Banned in China episode in 2019. It is the same response they gave to the criticism of Cartoon Wars. The deadpan non-apology. The refusal to pretend that the institution's disapproval means anything about the quality of the work or the validity of the argument. The banned episodes are the one place where this posture has not produced a complete reversion to the status quo ante. The episodes that received death threats did not come back. the way the episodes that received angry letters from the Catholic League came back. The permanent ban on the 5 Muhammad episodes is the one outcome in the show's controversy. History that the We're Terribly Sorry shrug has not been able to reverse. That distinction matters. It tells you something about where the actual line is in the history of South Park's relationship with controversy. The line is not the shows that made the most powerful institutions angry, because the show made the actual United States government officially condemn it, and the show continued and grew. The line is the specific material threat of lethal violence against specific identifiable people with home addresses. That is the one thing the show's momentum could not move past. Not because Parker and Stone backed down, but because the network made a different calculation, and the show lives on the network's platform. The 5 episodes sitting in their unavailability are the monument to that calculation, not a monument to censorship as a principle, because Comedy Central's decision was situational and fear-based rather than principled. A monument to the specific moment when fear was sufficient to override everything else. And a monument to the ongoing question of whether that calculation, made in 2010 when there were NYPD officers standing outside the building, still needs to be the answer in 2026. Nobody has officially answered that question yet. Part 11. The Philosophy of the Paper Kids. Here's what I keep returning to, sitting with all of this in the late-night quiet. These are construction paper children. Or, since the pilot, the digital simulation of construction paper children, moving through scenes that are designed to replicate the visual quality of things made with scissors and glue. The crude aesthetic is a deliberate choice that Parker has explained in various interviews and commentaries. The handmade look is part of the comedy. It creates a kind of unreality. It signals that what you're watching is artificial in a way that gives the audience permission to engage with it rather than being overwhelmed by it. The crudeness is the permission slip. And yet, these construction paper images were powerful enough that their broadcast generated real security responses. They were powerful enough that the people who threatened violence over them were eventually connected to federal terrorism investigations and received federal prison sentences. They were powerful enough that a sitting congressman drew a line between them and a near-mass casualty attack in the middle of New York City. They were powerful enough to bring about the most extensive act of self-censorship that American broadcast television had experienced since the McCarthy era, at least as measured by the degree to which a network altered a creator's finished work without their knowledge or consent. What does it mean that a cartoon made with the visual vocabulary of a children's craft project reached far enough into the real world to produce those consequences? What does it tell us about the relationship between images and the world that images represent? That something so formally childlike could carry such weight? I think it tells us that the medium is not what determines the power of a statement. The medium creates the context in which the statement is received, and the context shapes the reception. But the statement itself carries power that is independent of how crude or how sophisticated the delivery mechanism is. The South Park kids are paper. The questions they raise about free expression and institutional fear and equal treatment under editorial standards are not paper. They are as real as questions get. Parker and Stone made 5 episodes that tried to answer one question in one consistent direction across 9 years. The depiction of Muhammad should be held to the same standards as the depiction of anyone else. That's the argument. It's not a complicated argument. It's not a nuanced argument. It's a statement about the operating principle of satire, which is that satire loses its meaning when some subjects are placed outside its reach by force rather than by choice. Comedy Central answered in the other direction, in a moment of real fear and real human concern. And the 5 episodes sit in their unavailable space, making that argument in their absence. Part 12. Where the Story Stands. The episodes are still gone. As of today, in April 2026, they cannot be streamed on Paramount+. They are not available for digital purchase through any major platform. The Paramount Plus transition from HBO Max, which drew international attention when fans discovered that up to 15 episodes seemed to be missing from certain regional libraries, ultimately clarified that the domestic unavailability was limited to the 5 Muhammad-related episodes. The other perceived gaps were licensing and regional rights issues that were resolved. The core five remain in their original status. The physical DVDs exist and contain the episodes. Season 5 has Super Best Friends, uncut, as it aired in 2001. Season 10 has both parts of Cartoon Wars. Season 14 has 200 and 201 in their censored forms. You can hold them. You can watch them. The information is accessible if you know where to look and are willing to go through the physical media pathway that most contemporary viewers no longer use. Parker and Stone have not changed their position. They have not acknowledged the episodes as mistakes. They have not suggested that the censorship was appropriate or that the argument was wrong. In the commentary tracks, they say what they know how to say about it. They delivered the show they intended to deliver, and the network changed it, and they weren't asked. The show continued. The next episode was always waiting. Season 14 produced more episodes after 201. Season 15 came. Seasons 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, on through to 28, with more coming. Every season brought new targets, new controversies, new moments where some institution or government or celebrity or organization tried to make the show stop and the show kept going. The banned episodes are the one place where the show couldn't move past the consequence and pull it back in as material. That doesn't mean the argument is over. It means the argument is still pending, held in a kind of legal and cultural suspension, while the world figures out whether the circumstances that produce the ban are permanent features of how things work, or whether they can be revisited when enough time has passed and enough other things have changed. Maybe the episodes come back someday, maybe they don't. The question they were asking is still a live question. The answer hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is how old the question has gotten, and how practiced the silence around it has become. Closing. The quiet at the end. The lights have been down for a while now, wherever you are. The clock is saying what clocks say late at night, which is that the ordinary world is somewhere else, and this is the in-between time when things are allowed to just be what they are. South Park started as a Christmas card. Two students from Colorado working with construction paper and glue and an old camera and $750, making something that $2,000 had commissioned and nobody had authorized to spread. And it spread anyway, the way things spread before anyone knew what virality was, passed from hand to hand and floppy disk to floppy disk in the early months of an internet that barely existed. It became a show that has now lasted almost 3 decades and produced more controversy than almost any other program in American television history. Within that history, there are 5 episodes that live in a different kind of silence. Not the silence of forgetting, because they have not been forgotten. Not the silence of irrelevance, because their irrelevance is regularly disproven by the conversations they still generate. The silence of a decision that was made under specific conditions, by people who were genuinely afraid, and that has not been revisited in the years since. Muhammad flew over Washington with fire powers in 2001. Nobody said anything. Stan and Kyle reconciled on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and were genuinely, briefly friends, in the simple way that children can be friends before everything gets complicated. That episode is banned. Kyle gave a speech about how the power of threatening people with violence is the only true power, and that terrorizing people works, and a network censored the speech because it was afraid of violence. The proof was in the censorship. That speech is still officially bleeped on the only disc that contains the episode. In the only official form in which the episode exists, there's a version of the story that ends with the episodes coming back. That the world continues to change in ways that make the calculation less severe? That the specific conditions that produce the ban continue to soften? That someday Paramount Plus or its successor platform includes the 5 episodes with appropriate context and the argument is allowed to finally finish? That version is possible. It might be probable given enough time. But even then, the fact that it took this long, that a cartoon arguing against censorship was censored, and the censorship held for more than a decade and a half, is itself a kind of document. An account of what happens when images reach into spaces that are charged with more than images are supposed to carry. What happens to institutions when they are afraid? What happens to arguments when the acts that make the arguments dangerous also prove the arguments correct? South Park was born controversial, made out of controversy the way other things are made out of clay. The banned episodes are the place where the controversy became something that the usual mechanisms couldn't process, where the shrug and the mock apology in the next episode weren't sufficient, because the stakes had moved into territory that required a different response. Parker bought the plane ticket to South Africa and showed it to the executive and didn't go. He went back to work. The next episode was Waiting. Season 27 premiered in July 2025, and the White House condemned it, and the ratings were the highest in 7 years. The construction paper kids are still there, still saying things, still making the wall hear it, even when it doesn't want to. That's worth something. It's been worth something for almost 3 decades. And it will keep being worth something for however long they keep making it. Sleep well. You can pick this back up whenever you need it. If this kept you company tonight, a subscription genuinely helps this channel keep going. And drop a comment about where you're listening from. I want to know. Good night. North Park. https://www.youtube.com/@northpark. Extended section. The culture of fear around images. A deeper look at why this matters. When people discuss the banned South Park episodes, the conversation often jumps immediately to the threats and the censorship, as if the interesting part of the story begins the day Revolution Muslim posted their warning. But the interesting part actually begins much earlier than that, in the decades-long evolution of a cultural understanding about what images are and what they're capable of doing. Images have been contested objects for as long as people have made them. The tension between the freedom to represent and the desire to protect what is considered sacred or private or powerful is as old as art itself. But the specific question that South Park bumped up against, the question of whether a particular religious figure could be depicted in a Western secular cartoon, had a very specific modern history that it's worth dwelling on, because understanding it changes how you understand why the show's situation became what it became. The Islamic tradition around the depiction of Muhammad is not monolithic, and this is an important thing to understand clearly. The Quran itself does not explicitly prohibit images of Muhammad. The prohibition developed through the Hadith literature, which is the collection of sayings and actions attributed to the Prophet and to his companions, and through subsequent legal and theological traditions that built on that literature. The prohibition is most strongly held in certain Sunni traditions and is considerably less emphasized in Shia tradition and in several historical Islamic cultures where depictions of Muhammad were produced with apparent religious sanction. There are Persian and Ottoman miniature paintings from medieval periods that show Muhammad, sometimes quite graphically, and that were made by devout Muslims for Muslim audiences. The version of the prohibition that had reached such charged political temperature by 2005 and 2006 was a specific, contemporary, politically amplified version, connected to the rise of a particular form of political Islam that had been building since the late 20th century, and that attached enormous symbolic weight to the question of depictions of Muhammad as a matter of Western respect for Islamic civilization more broadly. The Danish cartoons controversy was not, at its core, only about the cartoons. It was about a set of larger tensions between Muslim minority communities in Europe and the societies they had moved into, between Western secular concepts of press freedom and Islamic concepts of the limits on acceptable expression, between the specific historical and political grievances of Muslim-majority countries and the policies of the Western governments they held responsible for those grievances. The cartoons became the flashpoint for all of that accumulated pressure. And once the cartoons had produced violent protests and deaths, the depiction of Muhammad became charged in Western media in a way that was entirely new. Not because the underlying theology had changed, but because the political and social stakes of the question had been demonstrated to be severe in material, measurable terms. South Park was operating in this context when it made Cartoon Wars in 2006. Parker and Stone had been making content about religion for 9 years. They had depicted Jesus as a public access television host. They had depicted God as a small, timid, mammal-like creature. They had mocked the founding mythology of Mormonism with cartoonish historical reenactments. They had produced Trapped in the Closet's extended takedown of Scientology's cosmology, with a text caption confirming it was real doctrine. They had done all of this and received various amounts of criticism, and never once had Comedy Central placed a black title card over their content. The specific treatment of Muhammad was different, and they knew it was different. And the Cartoon Wars episodes were their attempt to make that difference visible and to argue that the difference was wrong. Not theologically wrong, not disrespectful. Pragmatically wrong, in the specific sense that allowing the threat of violence to determine what can be broadcast means that the threat of violence has been granted permanent editorial power. And that is a foundation for free expression that will always tend toward less expression rather than more. This is a genuine philosophical argument with a genuine tradition behind it. It connects to John Stuart Mill's arguments about the harm principle and the conditions under which expression can be limited. It connects to the foundational arguments about a free press and why a free press requires protection from governmental and other interference, specifically because the information that powerful institutions most want suppressed tends to be the information that the public most needs. It connects to the specific circumstances of the Danish cartoons controversy, in which the newspaper that published the cartoons was making an explicit argument about whether self-censorship in Western media around Islamic subjects was itself a kind of implicit capitulation to the threat of violence. None of this is to say the argument is simple or that the answer is obvious. The people who were most affected by the Danish cartoons, the Muslim communities in Denmark and elsewhere, who experienced the publication as a deliberate act of disrespect, had a genuine grievance about being treated as a community defined by its most violent elements, and about a long history of specifically targeted humiliation that the cartoon project represented for them. The argument between free expression and respect for religious communities that the Danish cartoons controversy produced is not one that has a clean resolution, and it would be dishonest to present it as one. But South Park was not operating in that complicated space. The show was not making images designed to humiliate or degrade. Super Best Friends gave Muhammad fire powers and let him save the reflecting pool. The bear suit in episode 200 was a workaround specifically designed to acknowledge the sensitivity while continuing to engage with the question. Even the uncensored version of episode 201 depicts Muhammad, to the extent he appears at all, in entirely neutral terms. The show was trying to say, here is an equal treatment argument. The logic is that satire requires the ability to apply the same treatment to all comparable subjects. Jesus appears in South Park repeatedly, in degrading contexts and absurd contexts and affectionate contexts and all the contexts between. If Muhammad cannot appear in any context, then Muhammad has been exempted from the equal treatment that defines satire as a form, and the exemption has been granted by the credible threat of violence. And that exemption is itself a statement about power. Extended section: Trey Parker, Matt Stone, and the psychology of not stopping. One of the questions that the banned episode's story raises implicitly is the question of what kind of people keep going. After Cartoon Wars was censored in the act of making its argument about censorship, Parker and Stone did not stop making South Park. After the death threats and the NYPD security details and the federal investigation, they did not stop. After Comedy Central altered their finished product without their knowledge and broadcast it to millions of people in a form they hadn't approved, they issued a statement, and then they went back to work. The next episode was already waiting. This quality, which looks from the outside like either extraordinary courage or extraordinary stubbornness, depending on your perspective, is actually something more specific than either. It is the quality of people who have never been able to separate what they do professionally from who they are as people. They are not performing defiance. They are not calculating that defiance will improve their ratings, although it has repeatedly. They are people for whom the show has always been the expression of something genuine, and stopping the expression because someone objects to it is simply not how they operate, because the expression and the objection were always going to coexist. The objection was always part of the territory. Parker has talked about the philosophy of the show in terms of the blank page. Every Monday, the production begins from nothing. There is no episode. There is a time slot and a network and a crew and whatever was in the news last week. And by the following Wednesday, the episode has to exist, complete and deliverable. The 6-day schedule is not just a production fact. It is the psychological framework within which the show operates. There is not time for second guessing. There is barely time for first guessing. You write the thing that seems funniest, the thing that seems truest, the thing that the show most needs to say about what is happening in the world right now. And then you make it as well as you can in 6 days and you send it in and you start over. This production model produces a specific kind of creative courage, which is the courage of irreversibility. Once you're in the middle of the week, you're making the episode. You don't have the leisure to decide afterward that you'd rather have made a different one. The pace forces commitment. The commitment makes the show what it is. It also means that when a finished episode is altered by the network without the creator's knowledge, the violation is more acute than it would be for a show with a different production model. Parker and Stone don't have a development process that includes extensive network notes. They have 6 days, a finished product, and a broadcast. When Comedy Central placed bleeps over Kyle's speech and censored bars over Muhammad's image, they were acting on a product that its creators had already committed to entirely. There was no revision process. There was only the original commitment and then the network's alteration of it. The anger Parker expressed through the South Africa ticket purchase and through the statement issued by South Park Studios is the anger of someone whose finished work was changed without their consent in the most public way imaginable. It is the anger of a carpenter who made a table, handed it to the client, and watched the client put a cloth over the top before anyone could see it, and then claimed that the cloth was always part of the table. They went back to work the following Monday. The next episode was already waiting, because that's how they operate, and no institutional decision about what they're allowed to show is going to change that fundamental quality of the operation. This resilience, which the show has demonstrated consistently across nearly 3 decades, is both an artistic fact and a commercial one. The economic model of South Park has always been one of the things that protected it from the kind of corporate pressure that has canceled or defanged other controversial shows. The production budget for South Park is, relative to other hit shows of comparable cultural impact, remarkably modest. The animation style, while sophisticated in its digital execution, does not require the infrastructure of a major animated film. Parker and Stone do most of the voice work themselves. The writing staff is small. The 6-day schedule means no extended development windows where budgets can spiral. A show that costs relatively little to make and draws massive audiences has leverage with its network that a more expensive show would not have. If Comedy Central pulled South Park entirely, they would lose their flagship show and a substantial portion of their identity in the cable landscape. If Parker and Stone walked away from Comedy Central, they would lose the platform that had made them one of the most famous creators in television. Neither side has ever been willing to accept those consequences, which is why, despite all the fights and the censorship and the statements and the plane ticket that never got used, they're still together. The 2025 deal, reportedly worth $1.5 billion for 50 new episodes and streaming rights, is the commercial expression of a relationship that has survived every controversy the show has ever generated. The banned episodes are the one exception to this dynamic. They are the place where the network's decision was not a negotiating position to be argued back from, but a binary determination that has held for more than a decade. Not because the episodes were worse than others, because the circumstances that produced the decision were different in kind from the circumstances that produced every other network decision about South Park. Extended section, the comedy of equal treatment. Why the argument keeps mattering. There's a specific mode of comedy that South Park operates in that is relevant to understanding why the banned episodes argument isn't just a free speech argument in the abstract. It's an argument about the internal logic of a particular kind of comedy and why that logic requires equal treatment to function. Satire as a form depends on the audience's ability to see that the rules apply to everyone. When a satirist mocks a politician, the comedy is produced in part by the recognition that the politician, despite their power and their pretensions and their self-presentation as above criticism, is being measured against the same standards as everyone else. The exposure of the gap between how the powerful present themselves and how they actually are is one of the primary engines of satirical comedy. And that engine requires that the treatment be applied consistently, because the moment certain subjects are placed outside the satirist's reach, the satirist has acknowledged that some power is real enough to be immune to mockery, and the whole mechanism becomes inconsistent. South Park has always operated on the principle that nobody is exempt. Jesus gets mocked. God gets mocked. The founders of religions get mocked. The most sacred figures of every tradition that the show's creators have encountered get the same treatment as every secular celebrity and political figure. The consistency is the point. The consistency is what makes the show's satire work. Because you can't laugh at Mormonism's origin story and Christianity's miracles and Scientology's cosmology and then turn around and grant Muhammad a special exemption without the audience noticing that the comedy has a hole in it. The audience notices. It's been noticing since Cartoon Wars. The episode's central joke, the double standard demonstrated by Comedy Central's own censorship choices, lands because the audience recognizes immediately that there is something structurally broken about a satirical show that can say absolutely anything about every religion except one. The structural inconsistency undermines the premise of equal treatment, and equal treatment is what makes the comedy honest. Parker and Stone are not making the argument that Muhammad should be depicted in degrading or hostile ways. They have, in every relevant episode, depicted him in positive or neutral ways. The argument is more foundational than content. It is that the ability to choose to depict him, even positively, even neutrally, even in a bear suit handing Peter Griffin a helmet, must be present for the equal treatment principle to function. And the absence of that ability, produced by the credible threat of violence, is the thing that makes South Park's satire structurally incomplete in a way that no other external pressure has managed to make it. This is why the episodes remain a live question, even 15 years after they were banned. It's not primarily about whether the specific jokes were good or the depictions were respectful. It's about whether satire can operate with a permanent exemption in place without losing the quality that makes satire worth doing. Extended section. The small details that make the story. Human history has a way of getting abstract. The banned episodes of South Park, when you describe them in the context of geopolitics and free expression theory and network corporate structures, can start to feel like an argument in a textbook rather than a thing that happened to real people making a television show in a building in Los Angeles. So let me spend a moment on the small human details. When Comedy Central moved to midnight programming after the pilot's complaints, the cast and crew didn't slow down. They sped up. The show was getting more ambitious by the week in its first season, not less. Parker was writing and directing and voicing multiple characters per episode while also managing the overall creative vision of the show. Stone was producing while also performing. They were doing what people in their 20s do when something they care about is working. They were going all in on it, past the point of comfort, into the territory where the work costs something real. When the show became a phenomenon, they didn't know how to be famous. They had been two guys making a cartoon. They became two guys making a cartoon who were also somehow the center of one of the most intense cultural debates about children's media since the emergence of rock and roll in the 1950s. They handled it the way they handle most things, by making more episodes, each one slightly more willing to go to the place the previous one had stopped just short of. Trapped in the Closet involved a specific kind of courage that gets overlooked in the celebration of the episode's brilliance. Parker and Stone knew, going into production, that making this episode might end their friendship with Isaac Hayes. They told him. According to Stone's account, they said it was nothing personal, that it was just what South Park did, and if they didn't do it, they would be treating Scientology differently than everything else they had treated. Hayes' response at the time seemed like understanding, even if it was complicated. And then months later, the stroke happened, and the press release appeared, and none of the nuance survived the institutional machinery that was operating around Hayes in the aftermath of his health crisis. When Parker and Stone found out how Hayes had actually left, years after the fact, there is an account in the Hollywood Reporter oral history of Parker's reaction, which was the kind of quiet devastation that falls on people when they realize that something they did out of principle for reasons they still believe were right, had consequences that they didn't know about and couldn't have prevented and wouldn't have wanted. They had been fighting Scientology. They had been right to fight it. And in the middle of that fight, a man they loved had been taken from the show by the very institution they were fighting, using his name without his knowledge, and they hadn't known. There is a particular grief in being right and having it cost you something you didn't intend to lose. Parker and Stone have never said they regret Trapped in the Closet. They have never suggested that the episode was wrong to make. But the way they've talked about Isaac Hayes since his son's account became public suggests a sadness underneath the public position, a knowledge of what the episode cost, even though the cost arrived through channels they couldn't have anticipated or controlled. The Cartoon Wars episodes were made in 6 days, while Parker and Stone were simultaneously negotiating with Comedy Central about whether the depiction could happen at all. They were writing an episode about a Cartoon Network refusing to show Muhammad, while their own Cartoon Network was refusing to let them show Muhammad. The irony was not lost on them. It was, in a certain sense, the entire point. The show was writing itself while it was making itself. The meta quality of the situation, which anyone who has made things for a living recognizes immediately, was extraordinary. You are making the thing about the thing while the thing is happening. The period after episode 200 aired, and the threats came in. And the NYPD showed up at the Comedy Central offices was, by Parker's own account in various interviews, the period where the difference between professional controversy and personal danger became real. The show had always generated controversy. Parker and Stone had always shrugged and kept going. But having actual law enforcement increase security at your network's building because of your cartoon is a different register of experience. It is the moment where the abstraction of free speech becomes the concrete of someone has published your home address and invoked the murder of a European filmmaker as a model for what should happen to you. Parker said he went back to work. That's the correct sentence for who he is. He went back to work. The Monday after the security was established and the FBI was involved, and Comedy Central was adding bleeps to his finished product, Parker sat down in front of the blank page for next week's episode. Because the next episode was always waiting. Because that's how the show works. Because stopping would mean that the mechanism had worked, and he was not willing to give the mechanism that. This, finally, is what the banned episodes are about at the level of individual human psychology. Not the geopolitics, not the legal framework, not the corporate decision-making. The individual person sitting in front of a blank page on a Monday morning, after a very bad week, choosing to write the next episode. That choice, made in the face of real fear and genuine institutional opposition, and the knowledge that the thing you're making will be altered without your permission before it reaches its audience, is the one thing that all the controversy, history of South Park comes back to. Parker went back to work. Stone went back to work. The next episode was waiting, and that simple, stubborn commitment is worth something. It has always been worth something. North Park. https://www.youtube.com/@northpark. Extended section, the other side of the argument, what the critics got right. It would be dishonest, in a piece about South Park and free expression, to only present the creator's perspective. The people who objected to the Muhammad depictions were not uniformly extremists, and the threats made by Revolution Muslim were not representative of the Muslim community's response to the episodes. Most of the reaction from Muslim organizations and communities was expression of hurt and frustration through legitimate channels, not threats of violence, and the tendency of the coverage to focus on the threatening fringe rather than the mainstream response created a distorted picture of what the controversy actually was. When episode 200 depicted Muhammad at all, even inside a bear suit, even inside a U-Haul, even in the context of a comedic premise about celebrities wanting to steal his power, it crossed a line that many devout Muslims regard as genuinely important. And the crossing of that line was experienced by many viewers not as a free speech exercise, but as a deliberate decision to do something they had asked not to be done. The fact that South Park had done the same or worse to Jesus and Buddha and Moses does not, for someone who holds the prohibition on depicting Muhammad as a sincere religious obligation, make the depiction acceptable. The equal treatment argument, from this perspective, misses the point. The point is not that Muhammad should be treated equally poorly. The point is that the depiction itself, regardless of how it's framed or how other religions are treated, is a violation of something real and important. This is a genuine argument. It is not the argument of extremists. It is the argument of people for whom religious commitments have a different logical structure than the secular liberal framework of equal treatment and free expression. Within that structure, there are things you don't do not because they will hurt someone's feelings, but because they are wrong in themselves, in the same way that many religious traditions have things you don't do, not because of consequences, but because of obligations. South Park's answer to this argument has always been implicit rather than explicit. The show never engaged directly with the theological question of why depicting Muhammad might be different in kind from depicting other religious figures. It engaged with the practical and political question of what happens when that distinction is enforced through the threat of violence in a secular media environment. Those are different questions, and conflating them is easy but inaccurate. Parker and Stone were not saying that the religious prohibition was wrong. They were saying that the enforcement of the prohibition through violence, in the American television context, had consequences for American television that American television needed to think about clearly. Whether you agree with that argument or not, it is an argument about media ethics and free expression, rather than an argument about religious doctrine. The people who found the episodes offensive from a sincerely religious standpoint had every right to that response. They had every right to express it through legal means: letters, advocacy, peaceful protest. What they did not have the right to do, and what Revolution Muslims' threats represented, was the use of violence and the threat of violence as a mechanism for suppressing content they found objectionable. And the distinction between those two responses is the hinge on which the entire controversy turns. Comedy Central's decision to censor the episodes was a decision made in response to the violent threats, not in response to the mainstream religious objection. The mainstream religious objection, expressed through normal channels, had existed since Cartoon Wars aired in 2006 and had not resulted in censorship. The censorship came when the threat of physical harm entered the picture. And that is the important distinction. Not whether the depiction was religious offensive, but whether the mechanism of its suppression was the democratic expression of religious sentiment or the violent coercion of an institution by people willing to commit murder. Extended section, the legal landscape. What banned actually means. When we say these episodes are banned, it's worth being precise about what that means legally and practically, because the word carries different weights in different contexts. The episodes are not banned in the legal sense of being prohibited by government authority. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the government from restricting speech and expression on the basis of content, with limited exceptions for narrow categories like direct incitement to imminent violence and child sexual abuse material. A government ban on these South Park episodes would almost certainly be unconstitutional under existing First Amendment jurisprudence, and no government agency has attempted to impose one. What has happened instead is a form of private censorship, which is legally distinct but practically significant. Comedy Central, as a private company, has the right to decide what it will and won't broadcast on its platform. Paramount Plus, as a streaming service, has the right to decide which titles it will include in its library. These are editorial decisions made by private entities, and the First Amendment does not require private entities to carry any specific content. The more specific question is why Comedy Central and Paramount have made the specific editorial decision not to broadcast these episodes. The answer is not, as far as any public record shows, a formal company policy prohibiting depictions of Muhammad across the board. Comedy Central has broadcast episodes that include Muhammad's name in various contexts in the years after the ban. The answer is more specific than a general policy. It is that these particular episodes, in their history and their specific content, are associated with a security situation that the network does not want to reopen. This is sometimes described as a form of ongoing implicit coercion. The idea that the threat that was made in 2010 is still functionally present because the episodes remain unavailable, and that the unavailability is the ongoing consequence of a threat rather than an independent editorial judgment. Whether that framing is exactly accurate is difficult to determine without knowing the internal deliberations at Comedy Central and Paramount, which are not public. What is public is that the episodes have remained unavailable through at least 3 significant changes in the streaming landscape. The original Comedy Central website hosting, the HBO Max era, and the current Paramount Plus era. Whatever the specific reasoning at each transition, the outcome has been consistent. The 5 episodes remain where they were. The DVD releases, which constitute the only official way to access the content legally, are technically available but practically inaccessible to most contemporary viewers who do not own disc players and do not buy physical media. The practical effect of the ban, in terms of how many people can access the content through normal viewing habits, is close to absolute. This has a specific cultural effect that is worth noting. When content is banned by a government, the prohibition creates attention and often increases interest in the banned material. The Streisand effect, named for Barbra Streisand's unsuccessful attempt to suppress photographs of her home by suing the photographer, describes how attempts at suppression often produce the opposite of the intended result. South Park has benefited from this dynamic in other controversies, where the controversy generated by objections to an episode invariably increased viewership. But the 5 banned episodes have not experienced the Streisand effect in the same way, because the mechanism of their unavailability is not institutional condemnation, but physical inaccessibility. People don't seek out what they don't know exists. For viewers who came to South Park after 2010, who found the show through streaming rather than through cable television, the 5 episodes simply don't exist in their experience of the show. They're not gaps that draw attention. They're absences that have become normalized. This is, in a way, the most effective form of censorship. Not the kind that makes people want to know what they're missing. The kind that makes people not know there's anything missing. Extended section. The night it all happened. A reconstruction. Let me try to make the experience of the week surrounding episode 201 as concrete and vivid as possible, because the abstract framing of censorship and free speech can make it feel like a policy debate rather than a human experience that happened to specific people in specific buildings on specific days. On Wednesday, April 14, 2010, episode 200 aired. The episode that Parker and Stone had been building toward for years. The 200th episode of their show, the one where every celebrity they'd ever mocked came back and wanted to meet Muhammad. 3.3 million people watched it that night. The overnight reviews were enthusiastic. It was the most watched cable program of the evening. The next day, Thursday, April 15th, Zachary Chesser posted his response on the Revolution Muslim website. He wrote, among other things, that Stone and Parker would probably end up like Theo Van Gogh. He included the address of the Comedy Central offices. He included a photograph of Van Gogh's body. He posted audio of an Al-Qaeda imam calling for killing people who defame the Prophet. Before posting on the Revolution Muslim site, Chesser had also written on his Twitter account, "May Allah kill Matt Stone and Trey Parker and burn them in hell for all eternity." The NYPD was notified. Security was increased at Comedy Central's New York building. The FBI opened an investigation into the post and the organization behind it. Over the following days, Parker and Stone were making episode 201. They had 6 days. The next episode was waiting. The blank page was Monday, which was already past. They were already somewhere in the week in the process of making the episode. They did not stop. They delivered their finished version of episode 201 to Comedy Central. On Wednesday, April 21st, the episode aired with Comedy Central's alterations in place. The bleeps. The censored bars. Kyle's speech buried under a continuous tone. Parker and Stone found out by watching it. South Park Studios posted its statement the morning of April 22nd. It confirmed the alteration was the network's, not a creative choice, not a meta-commentary. The speech about violence and intimidation had been bleeped out. Parker had purchased a plane ticket to South Africa and shown it to a network executive. Across the country, The Daily Show's Jon Stewart dedicated 10 minutes of his April 22nd episode to the controversy. He expressed disgust at Revolution Muslims' threats and told them, in characteristically direct Stewart fashion, where they could go. Bill Maher addressed the situation on Real Time. Senator Joe Lieberman publicly criticized Revolution Muslim. The mainstream media's reaction was clear and largely supportive of Parker and Stone. 10 days after episode 201 aired, on May 1st, a car bomb was found in Times Square and disabled by law enforcement. The attempt had failed. Nobody was hurt. Congressman Peter King went on record suggesting the South Park controversy might have been a factor. The investigation determined the suspect had been planning the attack for months before the South Park episode aired, predating the controversy entirely. Revolution Muslim denied any connection to the Times Square attempt. Zachary Chesser was arrested in July 2010, attempting to travel to Somalia to join al-Shabaab. In addition to the material support charge, the prosecution addressed his threats against Parker and Stone. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Jesse Curtis Morton, the Revolution Muslim co-founder who had worked with Chesser on the South Park response, was arrested separately and sentenced to more than 11 years. The organization had been the focus of counterterrorism investigation well before the South Park incident, and the investigation into it would contribute to the identification of individuals connected to multiple terrorism cases over the following years. 2 episodes of South Park were pulled from circulation. 3 more were retroactively pulled onto the same unavailability. Parker and Stone went back to work. Season 14 continued. The following Monday, they were at their desks with the blank page. Final extended section. What this sounds like at the end of a long night. There is something about the banned episode story that rewards being heard in the dark, which is why I've spent this time with it. Stories about power and the response to power tend to be told in the daylight in the context of formal analysis and institutional debate. They become arguments with sides and positions and rebuttals. They become policy discussions. They get abstracted. But late at night, when the analysis quiets down and what's left is just the story, what you hear is something simpler. 2 guys who met in a film class and made something crude and funny with $750 in construction paper, and who spent almost 30 years making that thing week after week in 6 days each time from a blank page, saying what seemed truest and funniest about the world they were watching. And somewhere in those 30 years, the world pushed back harder than it had before, and for a specific period around a specific set of episodes, the world's push was strong enough to affect what got broadcast and what didn't. The 5 episodes are still gone. The argument they were making is still pending. The specific circumstances that produced the ban have not been revisited in any formal, public way by the institutions involved. And Trey Parker and Matt Stone are still making South Park. Season 28 is ongoing. Season 29 has reportedly been confirmed. The show that began as a viral Christmas card in 1995 is still being made by the same 2 people who made it, on the same general principle, with the same production schedule, with the same fundamental refusal to treat anything as permanently off-limits. The White House condemned the Season 27 premiere. The Season 27 premiere had 6.2 million viewers in its first 3 days. The construction paper kids are still in their small Colorado town, still saying things, still generating the specific kind of noise that makes certain walls uncomfortable. The 5 banned episodes sit in their silence. And the silence is its own kind of statement about what the world decided it was worth to keep them there. That's the story. All of it. As much as the night can hold. Sleep well.